Well, if you're here last week, you know that Rob kind of dug into this idea of why Christianity. Why would we believe this particular set of ideas rather than a different one? And if you weren't here, I would encourage you to go back and kind of lean into that and look at that message on YouTube or wherever you can find it. But I'm gonna sort of jump off where Rob started last week, because one of the questions that's foundational to everything that we believe, if you've ever thought about sort of the logical pathway, and people come to faith all kinds of different ways. Some of you guys probably were sort of raised in the faith. Maybe some of you guys actually really did go on an exploration to find the truth. But regardless of that, the logical pathway to any faith is this core question of who is God? Is he even there? Right? And so the first question of approaching Christianity is there a God? But there's another second question that comes very, very quickly on the heels of that for a lot of us is actually, practically speaking, way more important. It's not a question of whether God is there, is he good? Does he care? Because actually, a God who is there but doesn't care about us that's actually worse, right? That's worse than nothing at all. That's our greatest fear, is a God who's in charge, but he's evil. And so one of the core questions that we want to wrestle with is this question, is God good? And there's an interesting question. My first piece of advice today is, if you don't have any atheist friends, you need to find some. You need to have some conversations with them. And when you do, I want you to ask them this question. Maybe not day one, but after you've gotten to know them a little bit, and you're talking about, God or not God, right? I want you to say to them, hey, would you tell me about the God that you don't believe in? And what's really interesting is they'll have an answer. Every atheist I've ever talked to has a very specific answer to what it is about God that they don't believe. Because atheism is a rejection, and it's a rejection of something. And here's the interesting thing, is most of the time I get to say, well, I'm an atheist about 90% of the same things you are. Right. Because when they start talking about God, the God that they have rejected, I'm like, well, I don't believe that either. They start quoting, the introduction to God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and they say, well, the God I don't believe in is misogynistic, homophobic. He's a bully. He's a cosmic bully who just wants to commit genocide all over the earth. And I'm like, well, if that's who I thought God was, I wouldn't want to follow him either. And so then we get to have this conversation about, well, who is he really? What does the Bible actually really say about who he is? Because the question of trust in God is actually fundamentally the question of his goodness. So that's the first thing we're going to deal with, kind of in parallel with one other question. But it gets to this idea that we need to get some clarity on our definitions. You ever not known what a word means and it cost you? Anybody ever had this experience? Okay, so when I was learning how to sort of fix cars, and I'm certainly no mechanic, but I can do some basic things like changing oil. And when I was in high school, I was a young kid first learning how to change the oil on my car. And my brother happened to have a friend who worked at an auto parts store, and I noticed that the bolt, the drain plug on my oil pan was leaking. And so I'm like, I got to figure out what I need to do about this. And so I go to the auto parts store, talk to my brother's friend, and he's like, oh, you need a self-tapping bolt. You need a bolt that's going to create new threads in your oil pan. And so I'm like, okay, that sounds cool. I have no idea what you're talking about, but sure, give me that thing that you're talking about. And so he says, here's what you do with this. You just take it, you put it up there real gently, carefully, and you just tap it in, and then it'll create new threads as it goes in, and then you take it back out, and then you have basically a new whole system. Now, I realized after the fact, I didn't know what the word tap means in this context. If you don't know what a self-tapping bolt is, it's a bolt that has threads that are sharp, and so it actually cuts a new pathway, and so you essentially have a whole new thing once you're done. So as a 17-year-old, I was like, okay, tap. I got to tap this thing into the bottom of my oil pan. So I put it up there, and I get my hammer, and I start tapping. And I'm like, this doesn't feel like it's going to work. I don't know how in the world this is going to cut new threads when I'm just hitting it with a hammer, but he said this is what I do. So and he had warned me. He's like, sometimes it takes a couple of tries, so don't worry about it. It's like a $2 part, so bring it back if it doesn't work. And so I mean, I pull this back out, and it's like sheared off. right? Like there's no more threads on this bolt. And I'm like, well, he said I could take it back and try it again. And so I take it back and I hand it to him and he's like, oh my word. What kind of car is this on? Like what? I've never seen anything like this before. That's amazing. And I start thinking as he hands me the new one, maybe I should ask him what he means. And so he tells me, he's like, yeah, you just put it up there and then you screw it in. Really, that's what tapping means. And I was like, that makes a lot more sense. Now, the consequences of that were not hugely significant. He even gave me a free second bolt. But I think it's a good example of the fact that sometimes when we don't know what our words mean, when we don't examine the words that we use, sometimes we make bad decisions. And so there's this word that the Bible uses that I want you to think about. And there's notes in your bulletin. If you got a bulletin on the way in, I would love for you to just process some of this and fill some things out and take some notes so you can think about this more later. But I want to ask you, now don't worry, I'm not going to pass a microphone around and make you describe this, but how would you define the word righteousness? It's a word in the Bible that's used to describe essentially a good person, right? How would you define the word righteousness? Another way to think about this is to ask you the question, who is the most righteous person you know? Think about all the people you know. Who would you put at the top of the list? Now, again, I'm not going to make you point to them if they're in the room or anything like that. But who's the most righteous? Who's the most godly person you know? Who would go to the top of the list? And why? Why would you describe them that way? The answer to that question is going to become important as we talk today. I want to examine this a little bit, and I want to ask the question, how does the Bible define the word righteousness? And of course, we can't do a study of the entire Bible. We can look at a couple of places. There's one place where the word righteousness comes up out of the mouth of Jesus. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says this in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness, there's our word, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you're not familiar with the first century and kind of the social world that Jesus lived in, the Pharisees and the scribes were these people who were wholeheartedly 100% committed to obedience to the law of God. Every single thing that they did, every step that they took, every breath that they breathed was committed to following exactly what God said and to doing it perfectly. They built their entire lives. They would count their steps every Saturday to make sure they didn't walk too far because God said don't work. They actually made a law. I'm not making this up. They said on Saturday, you may spit. You may not spit in the dirt. You may spit on a rock on Saturday. Now, my only justification I can think of for this is that if you spit in the dirt, you might accidentally grow something. And of course, then you would be farming and you had broken the law of God. So Jesus says this. He says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds, unless you go even further than they do, you're not part of what God is doing in the world. So what does Jesus mean by this? How do we think well about this? Well, there's two possibilities. One is the explanation you've probably heard, that if you were to get to heaven on your own merits, it could only be because you were completely and totally perfect, and not even the Pharisees, even with all of their commitment and all of their step counting and all their spitting only on rocks on Saturday. All of those things, you had all of that together, and they're still not perfect. Now, that's true. The only person who's ever lived a truly perfect life was Jesus. But I don't actually think the point that Jesus is making is that the Pharisees weren't hardcore enough. I don't actually think that's what he's saying. Because there's another possibility. The other possibility is they were like me as a high schooler. They didn't know what their words meant. The other possibility of what Jesus is saying, the point that he's making, is that the Pharisees they don't actually even know what righteousness is. They have the wrong metric. They have the wrong measuring stick for what this word means. Now, I think that for two reasons. I think that's what Jesus is getting at. First of all, because of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said in the thesis to the Sermon on the Mount, he said, I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, I came to fulfill them. In other words, I'm going to help you understand what the law is actually all about. And he spends the rest of those 3 chapters unpacking that and saying, here's what God was trying to do from the beginning. And these guys, in all of their effort, have actually missed the point. That's what the rest of the Sermon on the Mount actually is if you read those 3 chapters. And if you really want to dive into that, go read those 3 chapters. If you really want to dive hardcore into it, read Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. He unpacks that over about 300 pages. So that's reason number 1, that I think this is the point of what Jesus is saying. But the second reason is the way that Matthew introduces us to the idea of righteousness in his book. See, if you don't know this, when the Bible introduces us to an idea, it helps us understand how we're supposed to think of that idea for the rest of the Bible. The first time you see a word in the Bible is important, or in a particular book, and it sets a tone for how we're to think about that. Just a tidbit, this is kind of a fun one. The first time the Bible mentions the word love, the first time the Bible uses the word love, is way past when we think it would show up. It doesn't show up until Genesis chapter 22. You can go back and read that. You'll notice it's the first time in the Bible you see the word love. And the way that we think about love for the rest of the Bible is defined by what happens in Genesis 22. So where does the word righteousness first show up in the book of Matthew? It's a very interesting place. It's a story that we're all familiar with. It's in the Christmas story. So to give you a background, you guys know the story. Mary gets pregnant. This is a problem. Because this is a world where you shouldn't be pregnant when you're not married, and certainly her husband knows that he didn't do this. And we are in a space right now in this story where in the verse that we're going to look at, he does not know yet that she's telling the truth, that this is something that God has done. He doesn't know yet. God has not yet confirmed to him that she is telling the truth, that she's still a virgin. So these two are engaged. She shows up pregnant. Joseph assumes, fair assumption, this has happened in the normal way. She's an adulteress. God's going to confirm to him that she's telling the truth, but he has not done so yet. So under the assumption that Joseph knows her to be a person who's cheated on him and got pregnant as a result, here's what it says. In Matthew 1:19, it says, her husband Joseph, since he was a righteous man. Now, pause there. Because he is a righteous man. What's the rest of the sentence in your mind? How does that end? Before you read it, I know it's up on the screen behind me. You already cheated. It's fine. But think about this. If you just had the first half of this sentence, how would it end? What would a righteous man do when he knows that the woman he trusted most in the world has shown up pregnant and the baby is not his? And there is a law in place that allows him, doesn't require him, but allows him to enforce capital punishment as a result. What does a righteous man, a godly man, do in this situation? This is how Matthew introduces us to the idea of righteousness in his book. And it says this. We'll read the second half of the sentence. It says, her husband Joseph, since he was a righteous man and did not want to disgrace her, he planned to send her away secretly. Because he is a righteous man, he shows mercy. Don't argue with me about this. It's Matthew. That's what he says under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. This is God's definition of righteousness. He says, because he was a righteous man, he shows mercy. Now, part of the reason we're uncomfortable with this is because we don't understand what the law actually said. We assume that the Pharisees were right, which, by the way, is not a great way of interpreting the Bible. A lot of times when it comes to the law, we read what the Pharisees say and we're like, they must be right. They knew it. It's not what Jesus said. The actual law about adultery said that the furthest end of punishment, the most extreme you could go, was capital punishment. But it wasn't required. It was up to the discretion of the community based on the severity of the situation. The interesting thing about this as we think about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is sometimes we misunderstand what Jesus did. Sometimes we misunderstand what he was all about. Sometimes we think that Jesus was an editor of the law, that he changed the law, that it was going in this direction. He was like, no, we're going to take it back this way. Jesus was actually an interpreter of the law. The thing was not that Jesus changed the law. The thing was that he understood it. And he helped other people to understand it. Here's another example. In John 8, we read this story about the woman caught in adultery. We know this story. That's a famous, famous story. Even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard this story, or at least a quote from it, where the Pharisees, again, great guys, by the way, the Pharisees bring this woman who's been caught in adultery. They bring her before Jesus, and they misquote the law to him. This is what we usually miss about this story. They say to Jesus, Moses commanded us to stone her. That's not true. Moses allowed it. The law allowed it, again, depending on the situation. But Moses, the law, the Holy Spirit through Moses in the Old Testament, gave also a process to do this the right way. It was a process to allow justice to prevail. In a situation like this, the law specified that there had to be a trial, and there had to be 2 witnesses, minimum. And here's the kicker, and this is what Jesus appeals to. Again, not because he's changing the law, but because he knows it. The law specifies that if in a capital case, the person who is the formal legal accuser has to actually throw the first stone. Now, that's a pretty darn effective way of getting rid of false accusation, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, look what she did. Go take her away somewhere and do away with her. It's another thing to be at the front of the crowd, actually literally physically causing her death. And so Jesus knows that the law doesn't give him the authority to make this decision. And don't you love how Jesus slows down the drama of this situation and so many others? Anytime there's chaos around him, Jesus is like ignoring it, like he's drawn in the dirt. And they're like, Jesus, what's going on? And he just continually, over and over and over and over again, he slows down. He gets rid of the drama. Jesus is never motivated by anxiety. Not once. And so Jesus says to them, I love this about him. He's like, hey, listen, if we're going to be hardcore and enforce the law, let's read it first. And he looks at the crowd. He says, okay, who's the accuser? Who's throwing the first stone? And the detail I love in this story is it says that they began to leave. They dropped their rocks and they walked away. And it was the oldest first. Why? The oldest knew the law best. They'd studied it most. They knew that Jesus was right. And what I want you to understand is that Jesus is not changing the law. He's not making up something new. He's not more gracious than the law. He's the one who actually understands what it has been saying all along. So 2 key ideas I want you to wrestle with today. The first one is this. If we really understand what the Bible says, we understand that righteousness softens my heart. Righteousness softens. It doesn't harden my heart. We got to talk again. We got to talk about this people that you thought of earlier when I was asking you, how would you define righteousness? Who is the most righteous person that you know? Who is the most godly person that you know? Think about that person. Bring them back to mind. And I want to ask you, would soft-heartedness be one of the ways that you would describe them? If it's not, you might have a disagreement with the Bible about what righteousness means. Because according to the Bible, righteousness softens my heart. Second thing I want you to think about today is this. This is just a tip for you that we're going to apply here in a second that will help you understand the way that the Bible works. As we go to read the Bible, we need to understand this, that the teaching portions of the Bible go hand in hand with the stories of the Bible. The teaching portions of the Bible go hand in hand with the stories of the Bible. The Bible is a single unified book, and it teaches in a couple different ways. It teaches in sort of straightforward, direct teaching, which is what we find in all of the law sections like Deuteronomy and Numbers, and all the teaching sections like Philippians and Colossians. And then there's these gobs and gobs of stories. And the stories are the application. The stories are the law in real life. The stories are the ways that the Bible teaches us this is what this actually looked like in the real world. And that's what actually matters for us, right? We have to go to the stories of the Bible to see how the people of God applied and evaluated the Word of God. And this is just for you to think about. Some of you love ideas. You love theology. Don't get me wrong, theology is deeply important. But if your theology can't handle the stories of the actual Bible, you need to rethink some things. Right? Does that make sense? Story and teaching goes hand in hand. And so we're going to look at a particular story in the Bible that actually takes the law of God and says, hey, what would happen if people actually did what God said? It's not like this revolutionary story. It's just like people going, you know what? You're right about some stuff. Let's try it. See what happens. Okay? So my students ask me sometimes, now, I taught Rob years and years ago. I've been in education for most of my career. I'm now the campus pastor down at Dakota Christian University. I teach some Old Testament classes and, speak in chapel and do some different things. And my students, because of that, once in a while will ask me a really unfair question. What's your favorite book of the Bible? And I'm like, come on, guys, you can't ask me that. So I at least make them narrow them down. I'm like, okay, Old Testament or New Testament, which do you want to know? And so then they'll say Old Testament because I teach Old Testament. And then they really are shocked when I say Ruth. They're like, that's weird. Well, you should read it. And the reason I say that is this. The book of Ruth is the best example we have in the Bible. It's the best example we have in the Bible of the law working the way it was designed to work. Ruth is the only place I know of in the Old Testament where people as a whole are like, yeah, God, let's do it your way. Let's actually try this. Let's actually put this into practice. And the thing I love about it is it happens during the time of the judges where everything else is mass chaos. Everything else is just absolutely falling apart. So let me give you a little bit of background. And I want to remind you that the purpose of law, the reason laws arise is because we have problems to solve, right? Something happens and we go, what do we do about that? And a law is like an agreement among a community of people or a nation that says, here's how we respond in this particular situation. Here's how we handle this. So one of the situations that we're still dealing with today, that they were dealing with in the Old Testament, is what do you do with people who are what the Bible calls destitute? In other words, they are in poverty, they are down on their luck, they don't have a way of providing for their own needs. And generally, in this situation, we're talking about women and children. So in particular, when we have women and children who don't have protection, they don't have provision, they can't build their own life, they can't have jobs, they can't provide for themselves, what does the community do? And so the law of God shows up in the middle of this situation, and God puts in place two laws that we're going to see in practice here in the book of Ruth. The first one is this, the law of gleaning. Now, I want to give you a little background on this. The law of gleaning said that you, as an individual, could harvest your fields. Let's say you were growing wheat or barley or whatever it is that you grow. When you go to harvest your field, if you're harvesters, because remember, there's no John Deere yet, there's no tractors, there's no combines, there's none of that stuff. They just are like by hand cutting down the stalks and then picking them up. And when you go to pick them up, you're inevitably not going to get all of it, and some of it's going to fall out. And what God said is when that happens, you can't go back a second time and you can't pick it up. And the reason is because that doesn't belong to you. It's not yours. That belongs, ready for the list? That belongs to the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the destitute. It's not yours. Same is true of the corners of your field. You can't just go back through and comb through and get every little bit. Such an interesting law, isn't it? Because what this meant is that so long as they were willing to do a little work, no one ever starved in Israel. Remember the story in the New Testament? Maybe you don't. It's fine if you don't. The story in the New Testament where Jesus and the disciples are walking through a field. Grabbing food off the stalk and eating it. And the question we don't generally ask is like, whose field is this? Right? Like, you don't get to do that, by the way. This is not, the application is not go hop a fence and steal somebody's apples. You're going to come face to face with a shotgun if you do that. Our laws are different. But in Israel, it doesn't matter whose field it is. So there's a fundamental generosity that's built into the law that's designed to take care of widows, orphans, foreigners, slaves, the destitute. And anyone who is willing to work for a day is not going to starve. The second law is this. Second law is called the law of levirate marriage. Now, this is the complicated one. This one's got a bad rap because everybody understands it exactly upside down post-70s feminism, okay? So let's unpack this one a little bit. The law of levirate marriage says this: if you are a woman and you have a husband and your husband dies before you have a son who is old enough to take care of you, your dead husband's brother, it's his responsibility to take care of you. Okay, now this is what we need to understand about this. In this world, the single most reliable way to make sure that a woman and her children are taken care of is to give her a family. That's really still true. And so for that brother or cousin or whatever to come in and marry her is the most reliable way to make sure that she is taken care of, that she has hope, that she can rebuild her life. A couple things you need to know about these laws. One is they were optional for the people who were receiving from them. And that's what we miss about the law of levirate marriage. That our world is so up in arms. They want to throw away the whole Bible because of this law, but they don't get it. It was optional for the woman. She had all the options in the world. She had all the freedom in the world. And the practical result of this is there's a whole army of men who know that they are responsible to make sure that no matter what she chooses, no matter what she wants, no matter what she decides, she is not going to starve. She is under our protection. And somebody's going to step up and say, I will make sure that she and her family are okay. That's the plan. Which is why in the Bible, every time we see this law taking place, being put into practice, it's the woman driving the bus. It's the woman who wants it to happen. And by the way, there's a situation with Zelophehad's daughters where they don't want this, and they go to Moses, and they're like, hey, can we just have the land for ourselves? And Moses goes to God, and he's like, hey, I don't know, this is out of the ordinary. Can I give them land? And God's like, sure, great. So our understanding of this system is completely upside down. Here's the point. In these two laws, God created both a short-term and a long-term plan to make sure that if you were destitute, if you were struggling, if you had no one to care for you and to protect you, there's a whole community that because of the law of God, not because they were great people, not because they were so smart, not because they had social brilliance and they came up with a new system. No, because God said so, because it was the law. So we're back to our question, is God good? What do we do with a God who would put this in place? And the thing we misunderstand about the book of Ruth is that we think Ruth is about heroes. Ruth is about normal people going about their business going, hey, God, I think you're right. And so I want you to write this down to summarize this whole thing. Because of God's law, it's on the screen up here, it's in your notes. No one in Israel, no matter their situation or background, would ever starve as long as God's law was followed. That's the actual practical reality of the Old Testament system. No one in Israel, no matter their situation or background, would ever starve as long as God's law were followed. And every time a woman and her children were left destitute, a whole group of men knew they were responsible to care for them. Ladies, can you imagine that for a second? Your life has just absolutely fallen apart. And the first thing that happens is like 10 men go, hey, we got you. We're not exactly sure how yet, but here's food for the day. Come back tomorrow and we'll tell you what our plan is and who is going to be assigned to you to make sure that for the rest of your life, you and your kids have family. It's a pretty good plan. Sounds an awful lot like a good idea for the church today. So here's your key question. What does all this mean about God? What does all this mean about the guy who set up this system, who thought of this ahead of time? thousands of years ahead of time. He said, hey, when life falls apart, here's what you do. So let's do this. We can take a sprint through the Bible, through the book of Ruth. But I want to remind you of a historical reality. Historically speaking, you can go do the study yourself. It has been true since the first century. Everywhere the Bible goes, life has gotten better for women, children, foreigners, slaves, prisoners, and the sick. The ideas of the Bible are so powerful and so profound that everywhere the Bible shows up, life gets better for all of those groups. Why? Because God cares about those groups. And because when God's people understand God's heart and live their lives like God lives his life, it works. And the most vulnerable benefit first. So here's the book of Ruth. You can flip there if you want to. We're going to kind of breeze through it. I would encourage you to go back and read it, maybe even today. It's only 4 chapters long, but it's so packed full. So here's what happens. You got a pretty cowardly man. His name is Elimelech. There's a famine in the land, in his homeland. He has a wife and he has 2 sons. And because he's a cowardly, unfaithful man, he runs off to enemy territory where he's going to be able to provide for his family, where he's going to find food. In the course of events, both his sons get married. All the men die. So now you have these 3 women, Ruth and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they're stuck because all of them have broken different laws and social codes. Ruth is a woman who's a Moabite, but she's not really, because she just married the enemy and now he's dead. So she can't really go home again because her home is going to reject her because she betrayed them by marrying her husband. But now her husband's dead and she can't go back to her husband's homeland because she's a foreigner there too. But there's something about what she's experienced with Naomi and the Jewish way of doing things that makes her go, you know what, I've got more hope going away from my home and trying my luck in Israel because of what they have told me about their God and their way of living. So I'm going to give it a shot. And here's what happens. This is one of the most famous verses in Ruth, and it's really crucially important to understand what really happens in this story. Ruth goes to Naomi. This is starting in verse 16 of chapter 1. And she says this, she says, wherever you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. This is what's called a proselyte affirmation. In other words, a proselyte is a person who's not born a Jew, not born an Israelite, and becomes one. They convert. It was always the case that someone could become a Jew. There's 2 different types of Jews in the Old Testament. There's people who are born into it, and there are people who become Jews. And so the laws against marrying foreigners weren't against marrying foreigners. They were against marrying foreigners who were not willing to leave behind their foreign ways and their foreign gods. This is why Ruth is not a problem and Jezebel is. Right. So Ruth makes this faith commitment. She says, I'm leaving my gods and my people behind and I'm going with you. She is now, legally speaking, a Jew. She's now an Israelite. And so she goes back with Naomi. By the way, this is how David's family ends up in Bethlehem. This is also the backstory for a guy you've probably heard of that comes along a little while later. His name's Jesus. This is his family. So we get to chapter 2, and we see this law of gleaning in practice. Now, we've got to think practically a little bit of what this would normally look like. See, if you are a person who is destitute, who is a foreigner, you're new in town. Everybody knows that you're new in town. And you show up at a field during the harvest time. And you got to remember, they needed their food just as much as we do. And so they're not going to, like, on purpose leave food behind for you. They're doing everything they can to gather all of the food. And so normally, if you were gleaning, you're like digging in dirt all day long. And you're not part of the harvest. In fact, they don't want you there. So you don't get food, you don't get water. You're going to spend the day in the dirt. And you're going to come home sweaty, exhausted. And you can't eat the food that you're picking up yet because it hasn't been processed. It's still on the stalk. And so what Naomi is expecting is for Ruth to come home with a handful of grains that they're going to have to work with and process and grind and make into a couple of cakes so they don't starve. And then she's going to have to go do it again the next day. So here's what happens. Ruth shows up in the field of a man named Boaz. And he notices her. He's like, hey, I heard about you. And remember, normally it would be, Oh, that's a vulnerable person. And you get in the wrong field and you know what that means. But Ruth shows up in Boaz's field and he sees her and he says to his workers, hey, don't make it hard for her. Drop a little extra so she can just walk by and pick it up. And then when it's lunchtime, he invites her over to the threshing floor with all the workers. He's like, hey, come on, come eat lunch with us. And they give her water. They give her food. They cook the food for her. And then when she doesn't eat it all because she's full, which was a rare experience back then, by the way, they give her a doggy bag of roasted grain. And at the end of the day, they're like, hey, bring yours. We're going to process it for you. Because remember, let me give you a picture of this. There's a big stone platform about the size of like from the middle of that section to me. Big stone flat platform. And they would take the wheat or the barley or whatever. They'd hit it with sticks to knock out the grains that they want to use. They'd throw it up in the air and the wind would take away the chaff so they have usable food. Right? And they say, hey, come process your food and go home with something you can use. So here's what happens. Ruth spends the day with them. This is kind of fun. She's making new friends. She's like, this is awesome. Like, I should do this all. This is a pretty good job. And Naomi is expecting her to come home, fingers bleeding, exhausted, and just to hand her food and collapse, right? And so Ruth walks in, and she's smiling, and she's clean. And she's like, man, I'm full. And Naomi's like, wait, what? She's like, yeah, can you take this? Like, all this food is heavy. She's like, by the way, here, you can eat this. This is cooked. And Naomi's like, okay, hold on. Ruth, where did you go? And Ruth, I mean, I imagine, I'm reading in a little bit here, but I think Ruth, being the innocent Moabite, is like, this is just how it goes. I don't know. Some dude named Boaz. But we have to stop for a second and think about this. Why does Boaz do what he does? Why does Boaz go over and above in protection and generosity? It's because he knows the law of God. It's because he knows the heart of God. Because he lives his life asking God, what would you do if you were living my life right now? How would you behave in this situation? And he realizes that the law of God, the instructions of God, the wisdom of God are a gift. It's a set of train tracks for him to walk on to live an incredibly valuable, significant life. It's so disappointing that we see Boaz as someone who is out of the ordinary. Because all he does is look at God and go, hey, what would you do? So then we get to chapter 3. Naomi realizes who this man is. She realizes he's what's called a goel, or a kinsman redeemer. He's a relative of theirs. And again, Naomi knows something that Ruth doesn't. Naomi knows that because of that relationship, he knows that he has a responsibility. He has a legal responsibility that when he sees one of his relatives who's in need, he has a legal and social responsibility to care for her. Ruth doesn't know this. Naomi says, hey, if we were modernizing it, I want you to do something really weird. In chapter 3, it gets weird. Because on that threshing floor, here's what this is how hard these people worked, right? They would spend the whole day harvesting. They'd bring it all to the threshing floor. They would just work and work and work and work and work. They would eat some of what they had taken in that day, and then they'd just crash right there on the rocks. They would all sleep in this huge group. Then they'd get up in the morning and just start working again. And so Naomi says to Ruth, she says, listen, I want you to do this. I want you to go to the threshing floor when he's asleep tonight, and I want you to lay down at his feet and cover yourself up with his jacket, essentially. Now, this is weird. It's a weird set of instructions. But here's a little background on what's going on. Men back then and on into Jesus' day would wear a prayer shawl or an outer garment, okay, and it would hang down, and sometimes they would refer to it as the wings, because if you think about it, if a man is praying and he puts that covering over his head and it hangs down even to his calves, if he were to grab that and put it out like this, it would look like wings. And there was usually embroidery on the bottom edges that would symbolize and represent his place in society, his name, and his family. Okay? So there's places in Jesus' life where this kind of shows up, and there's some different things that happen throughout the Bible that impact our understanding of the fact that this was true. But Naomi says, hey, go lay at his feet, and when he wakes up, ask him if he will cover you with that. Well, this is a proposal. It's a marriage proposal. We still do this in a way when a woman takes on her man's name, her husband's name. It's a way of saying, I'm coming under your covering, your protection. I'm becoming part of your family and being subsumed under your protection. And so this is what's going on. And it's so funny to me how people get offended by this story and they think there's some weird seduction or something going on. I'm like, they're out in the open. There's like 30 people all sleeping around. And the first thing he says when he sees her waking up, like, you're a virtuous woman. Like, it is literally impossible that this is any sort of sketchy situation at all. But she lays down at his feet, and when he wakes up, she says, would you cover me with the corner of your garment, with your wings? And he does it, and he immediately knows that this is a proposal. But here's what's fun about this story. Up until this point, we've watched Ruth and Boaz falling in love, right? We're like, oh, this is cute. Like, they've met each other, and like he's taking care of her. Are there feelings? And you know, there's this age difference where she's young and he's a little older, and what's going to happen, you know? And the music is like getting sweeter, and then we're like, yay, oh, it's building, and then it just bah, 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 right? Because Boaz is like, hey, listen, I'm really flattered, but there's another guy. There's another guy that he's in line before me, and I can't legally jump over that responsibility because, again, Boaz just over and over and over, he's just a good man. He does the right thing over and over and over again. So he's like, hey, listen, if he's not going to take care of you, I will. So either way, but we have to have this meeting. Either way, you're going to be taken care of. But we have to have this meeting. I have to go to the community. I have to go to the other leaders. I have to go to the elders. I have to go to the men in the community, and we have to have this meeting where we plot for your good. So go tell Naomi, I'll take care of it by the end of the day today. And he like lays another 6 measures of meal on her, which is probably this symbolic thing. So Naomi comes home with more grain. And the next day, we get another weird little corner of the Old Testament. Because Boaz goes and he stands in front of this other man and he says, listen, you and I both know that Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth are back in town and they're in need. They're destitute. We both know that it's our responsibility to care for them. And we both know that you're first in line. It's your responsibility first because you're the closer relative. We have to go back to Deuteronomy 25 to see a really bizarre but kind of interesting symbolic law in the Old Testament. In these situations, because remember, the law said that this was the man's responsibility. This is what it meant to be a good and godly and righteous man, was to take care for people who were vulnerable. And so if you were a relative of a woman who was destitute and you refused to step in, if you refused to sacrifice at great financial cost to yourself, if you refused to risk your own fortune to take care of someone in your family that you were bound to, what the community of people would do when you said no is they would steal your shoe and spit in your face. Now that's weird. But it's this symbolic thing, right? You refuse to walk the road that was in front of you. You refuse to take the responsibility. And so we're going to shame you. We're going to shun you from the community. We're going to make sure that everyone knows that you are the man who did not step up and do what God had put in front of you to do. So we get this scene. Boaz goes before the elders of the city. This is a legal gathering. He calls this man. What I love about Boaz is he lays it all out. He says, listen, man, I'm going to make sure you understand that there is zero risk for you in this. See, there's a field belonged to Elimelech. You and I, we have claim on this field. And there's maybe some financial benefit if there's not a woman involved here. If Elimelech just died and I get to inherit the land, then that's a win for me. So when Boaz says that, the guy's like, oh yeah, great, sure, I'll buy it. Awesome. I'm going to expand my empire. And Boaz goes, hold on. There's a woman as well to take care of, but I want you to know ahead of time that I want to be the kinsman redeemer. I want to do this. And so there's no risk for you. If you say no, I will step in. And so the guy, this is why it's a weird story. He takes off his shoe, he hands it to Boaz, he's, do your thing, man. And in this case, they don't spit in his face because there's no shame, because it's a mutual agreement. But I want to ask you again, why was there a group of men gathering together at the city gate, building a plan to make sure that for the rest of their lives, Ruth and Naomi were cared for and provided for? Because that's what God said you do. So here's what we learn from Boaz. I want you to write these two things down. We're going to give an application, and then we're going to pray. First thing we learn from Boaz is this: God's law is a pathway to the good life, not a restriction on my freedom. God's law is a pathway to the good life, not a restriction on my freedom. See, we interact with law in such a weird way that's so unbiblical. We think of the law, we think of the police as like the people who, mess me up and get me in trouble and put me in jail if I do something wrong, if I step out of line. That's not even what the word means in the Old Testament. The word Torah, the word law, means a way of living, a way of walking. It's instruction for life. And so Boaz, this is such an interesting contrast between these two men at the end of the book. Boaz sees God's law as a plan for the good life. Wow, what kind of person could I be if I take God seriously? How cool. God, why would you go to these lengths to explain to me how to build a life where I can have a life where I respect myself? Right. Because I know how to live, because I show up for other people, because I'm a man of honor. God, why would you go out of your way to allow me to build that kind of life? And the other guy looks at the law and he goes, hey, stay away. God, I don't really want you messing with me, because he understands God and he understands the law exactly backwards. Exactly opposite of the way that Boaz does. And then the second thing we see is this: true understanding of God's law gives me a true understanding of God's heart. Excuse me. True understanding of God's law gives me a true understanding of God's heart. And I ask you again, what kind of God would plan all this out? So here's my challenge. My challenge is to pick one thing in the law of God and ask yourself what it would look like to incorporate that into your life. Still getting over a cold. What would it look like to pick one thing from the law of God and to incorporate it into your life? I want to give you two examples as we wrap up. The first one is this principle of Sabbath that the Pharisees missed so badly. See, God gave Sabbath as a rhythm for our lives. That once a week we would shut everything off and we would remind ourselves that we're not production machines. So what would it look like for you to incorporate this into your life, into your family? Friday night to sometime Saturday. Not legalistic, but an opportunity to say to God, hey, I'm just going to be me for 24 hours. Not a worker, not a producer, not a production machine. And then maybe on a bigger scale, what would it look like for you to take God seriously the way that Boaz did? There's something fascinating happening right now in Rwanda. If you know the story of the 90s in Rwanda, there was mass genocide happening, war between tribal factions where they were trying to completely wipe each other off the planet. And because of this, there were hundreds of thousands of orphans across Rwanda. don't know if you know this, but there's a plan by next year to have the last of the orphanages in Rwanda closed down. Not by force, but because Christians looked around their country and they said, hey, all those kids that were left alone when their parents were killed, those are our kids. And 1 and 2 and 3 at a time, they have been adopted. One of the things about Africa is there's not a lot of hospitals, there's not a lot of universities, but there's an awful lot of churches. And in every one of those villages that was laid bare of all the parents, there are pastors who will look at their congregation and say, hey, there's 60 orphans half-mile from here in an orphanage. How many do you want? How many of them are joining your family? And we're about done giving families to every one of those orphans. Because Christians ask the same question Boaz asked. What would God do if he were living my life here and now? So I want to give you a chance to respond in 2 different ways. One is, maybe you've been wrestling with this question of faith, of like, do I believe any of this stuff? Does this Christianity stuff make any sense? And maybe today's the day that you're like, you know what, it clicks for me. The gospel, the idea that you and I, we were made by a God who loves us for the sake of relationship with him, and yet that's broken. You and I both know we've made mistakes, we've done things wrong. The Bible calls this sin, and you know that something with God is off. There's something deeply wrong. And that sin, it needs to be paid for. It needs to be forgiven, specifically because God is good. And so today maybe is the day you look at God and you go, you know what, I believe that Jesus, when he died, because this is God's solution, he sends his son, Jesus, to die in our place. We just celebrated it at communion, that the price is paid. That's what forgiveness is in Christianity. It's not God saying it's okay, it's not a big deal. It's God saying the price is paid in full for you and for me. And all that we do is open our hands and say, yes, I believe and I receive that free gift. So maybe today is that day for you, and in just a minute, you're going to pray a prayer to receive that gift and guarantee yourself a place in heaven and adoption into the family of God. But I want to give you a chance as well to respond by saying, God, what is it that you would have me do? What is the next step in my life of taking you seriously? What is the thing in your law, in your instruction, in your wisdom that you would have me put into practice in my life? So would you do me a favor so that we can process this? Would you just bow your heads and close your eyes for just a minute? And if that made sense to you, and for the first time you want to put your faith in Christ, you say something like this to God silently in your mind: God, I know that I'm a sinner. I've done things wrong. I've made mistakes, but I believe that Jesus died for me. And I'm receiving right now that gift, that free gift of salvation, being adopted into your family, forgiven forever, with a promise of heaven. If that's you and you just prayed that or something like it, I would love to know, not to embarrass you, but just so that I can pray for you, so that we can help you get connected here at Open Bible. And so in just a second, I'm going to invite you to just raise your hand up to let me know that. So if that's you and that made sense, and for the first time you're placing your faith in Christ today here in this room, would you just raise your hand up and put it right back down? Just for a minute. Just raise it up. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe for the rest of us, the challenge is to ask the Holy Spirit to give us clarity on what it is that is the next step. God, what is it that you want me to take you more seriously about? And so, Jesus, we open our hearts to your wisdom, to your guidance. We thank you for your goodness, your help, and your hope. We thank you that as your kids, we get to spend our lives imitating you. And we affirm today that that is a good and beautiful thing. Jesus, if we could live our lives even halfway like you, it would be so beautiful. And so we ask for courage. And we ask for strength to build a life that looks just like yours.